If you follow the news closely, at this moment, and there's no surprise that in the year of 2025, the global economy is about to take a new turn. Now, given the fact that today, under President Donald Trump, the economic consequences of Trump's tariff would be punishing. Now, at this moment, the nation of Canada, Mexico, and China faced a major obstacle when it comes to global issues. Now, we're looking at the political challenges, and also we're looking at this imbalanced relationship between US and with some of the partners. Now, some people are quite worried about the trade war between US and China. Now, needless to say, it should be concerning to the global citizen. But meanwhile, when we talk about China, the nation constitutes 1.4 billion people. At this moment, it's not just about the political drive, it's more about this economic ambition. And also, at the same time, the international community, it's also worried about this, what we call economic slowness in this country. Remember, there are still a lot more people, especially the newly graduates, are still hungry for jobs, but there's no guarantee that the younger generations are going to find ideal jobs. What is happening to the nation today? And how about the spending among the consumers? Are we going to see better solutions at this moment, or we're going to see a better future for the country? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Dr. Xiaochen. And Xiaochen is a freelance journalist and specializing in social, economic, and political issues in the Asia-Pacific region, as well as a U.S. college application mentor at the New Zealand-based global educational consultancy Crimson Education. Well, Xiaochen, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you very much, Will, and thank you, everybody. Nice to meet you, all the listeners.
Well, Xiaochen,
glad to be here.
Absolutely. It's an honor to have you on our show. Now, as we mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because this amazing article that you wrote, which is entitled, "The Big Myth About China's Low Consumption. Contrary to popular belief, Chinese consumers already spend much more of what they earned than their American counterparts. Low wages are to blame for stagnant consumption." Now, Xiaochen, from your perspective, I want to dive into the article right away. Now, within the article that you wrote, and I quote, "With the trade surplus hitting a historical high in 2024, China has faced criticism from other major trading partners like the European Union for boosting growth by allegedly dumping cheap exports in foreign markets." I guess this is one of the critical issues that we must talk about. Now, there's no surprise that we know that China is one of the largest economies in the world. And when we talk about trade relationship, it's all about the word fairness. Again, right. No one would like to get the shortest stick. But from your perspective, why do you think that China today is still facing some of the major criticism, especially from America and also from the European countries? So in other words, we want to play the game fair, but we understand you have to know there will be winners and losers in this economic situation. Your thoughts?
I think there's one thing that I did not specifically mention in the article, but it concerns sort of the sentiment that's related to economic development, whether it's in the US, in the EU, or other countries around the world, right? And this is something that is relatively recent. It's a belief that we need to have a manufacturing renaissance in order to have future economic growth. So a lot of the countries, including the US, under Biden, they were talking a lot more about bringing or reshoring a lot of the manufacturing capabilities back to the US, or back to at least more friendlier countries. Same has been said here in the EU, right? For example, in India, there is also a Making India initiative launched by Prime Minister Modi in recent years. So many countries are looking to manufacturing as a way to continue growing their economy in the future. But when they have this plan, they look at the current manufacturing landscape today around the globe, and they see this disproportionate amount of Chinese manufactured goods that are coming into their market, and they see no local champions, no local rivals that can fairly and successfully compete against these Chinese imports. And for them, whether it's true or not, there's a perception of unfairness in how manufacturing sector around the world has been structured. And they need to find a way to rectify this. And to criticize Chinese manufacturing overcapacity is one way to signal their political will that they're willing to bring manufacturing back home rather than just import goods from China.
Xiaochen, let's go back. Let's take a step back. We know that, again, during the answer that you just shared, we heard the word overcapacity. Now, according to the local state media, that Chinese government has strongly denied or tried to avoid use the word overcapacity. But from your perspective, what does that mean when we use the word overcapacity for China? And also, when we talk about tariffs, in the intro, we mentioned about the tariffs that Trump placed upon China. And from other perspective, when I talk to other economists, I guess they come to the conclusion that Trump, it's not really a believer of sanction, but he really believes that tariff works. So putting all the question together, again, what does overcapacity mean when we talk about China today in the 2025? And also, how do we know that, again, continue in this read or in the article, in the reading, that more European countries are still finding ways to put more tariffs upon China? And how do we know that it's going to work? And how do we know that China is going to play the game by the rules? Your thoughts?
I think in terms of the word overcapacity, it's not a purely economic one. It's more a political perception. I think I sort of alluded to this in my previous answer, but the use of the word overcapacity, especially when it comes to criticizing China among political leaders in, for example, the EU and the US, they're not really talking about sort of the technical aspect of just how much China's producing or how much they're selling or how extensive China's industrial supply chain is. They're more talking to their domestic voters, right? People within their countries, to signal the fact that, for instance, European or American manufacturing is falling behind is not really our fault. Right? It's not that sort of American or Europeans are incapable of manufacturing. It's that China is manipulating this and they are providing too much subsidy. They are giving sort of manufacturers an easier way to manufacture at a larger scale and to export at a larger scale. Right? And that, because of what China is doing, is hurting our manufacturing capabilities. So for them, that is what is defined in simpler terms as overcapacity. Right? So they're not really exactly looking at China's economic structure, right, or how Chinese manufacturing capabilities became what it is today, right? And frankly, the voters back home, they don't really care, right? What they care about is how their jobs in their countries will be secured, right? In the face of Chinese manufacturing capabilities. So I think to talk about overcapacity in a purely economic standpoint is a little bit difficult, right? And frankly, within the conversation among political leaders, is not as necessary as people believe it to be.
Well, Xiaochen, let's talk about another significant figure when we talk about US and China or talk about this global economy. I'm sure that you're familiar with that person as well, who is Elon Musk. And we know that within the new Trump administration, that Elon Musk has already caused quite a stir within the political field. And given the fact that, there's a rumor that Donald Trump and Elon Musk could shut down the USAID, which is one of the major, what we say...
already happened, I guess.
Well, I mean, as you and I were speaking right now, I mean, any game can be played at this moment. But meanwhile, one thing that we can't deny, it's Elon Musk. It's one of the most popular economic celebrities in China. I mean, think about that. His company, Tesla, it's running successfully in China. And also he has visited China many times and met up with the Chinese leaders and, local or internationally. But how do you think someone like Elon Musk, or even we talk about another figure, if I dare to say, Bill Gates, again, we talk about those people who not only have actively invested in China, but also have been dealing with the economic issue on the global level for a while. So from your perspective, how do you think that we understand their influence on this economic relationship between US and China, or between China and EU? How much do you think they can really sway or persuade at this moment?
Yeah. Talking about the U.S. specifically, within sort of the popular political belief, can we say, both among Republicans and Democrats, there's currently a bipartisan consensus that China is hurting the American economy. So it doesn't really matter whether you're Trump or a Biden supporter, Democrat or Republican. The common belief among the people, among the voters, is that we need to do something about China. Unless China can brought the line, they will continue to sort of slow down American economic growth in the future, right? So within this political environment, it's very difficult, even for popular sort of like businessmen like Musk, like Gates, to come out to say that we support closer economic relationship or business relationship with China, right? Despite what they actually do. Right. If you look at Musk, you can see sort of the contradiction here. You talked about Tesla in China. In China, they have a huge presence. Right? They have the Gigafactory in Shanghai, which interestingly have received a lot of Chinese government subsidies to happen. Right? They got cheap land from the Shanghai government in order to build the factory, and as is the case for many sort of new energy vehicles in China, for every purchase that consumers make in China of a Tesla model, there's government subsidy to make it cheaper, right? So this is sort of a little bit contradictory in that, for instance, the EU say, well, China uses subsidies to support Chinese companies. But you can say that, well, this is not really the case, because a company like Tesla is also getting Chinese subsidies, right? As long as it benefits the Chinese economy, the Chinese government is willing to work with foreign companies as well and provide the same sort of economic support, right, that it has provided to domestic companies, right? But of course, Musk, in his work for the Trump administration, will not go out and say that, well, Tesla has received this much money from the Chinese government. This is not simple. This is simply something that he will not do, right? In order to boost, of course, his personal support among the American electorate, right? And of course, among the other officials within the Trump administration. So at the end of the day, there's a contradiction here. But sort of the top line behavior of American politicians and American businessmen, they have to go along with this popular consensus that China is hurting us and we need to do something about it.
Xiaochen, since we talk about that there seemed to be a bipartisan consensus from the Democrats to Republican about China, now, again, going back to your article, the next portion we talk about is the consumer consumption in China. Right. Again, this is part of the title that Chinese consumers are already spending way more than American counterparts. How do we know that? That's number one. And number two, as we talk about that we just started the new year in 2025, again, we are still very concerned about this Chinese economic projection. So how do we know that when the Chinese consumers are spending or buying more commodities, that is actually a good sign? I mean, again, I am not an economist, and I don't ever put my money in the stock market, and nor do I ever sit down with, the what we call the expert of the Wall Street. But one thing I do know, that by spending more, which means there's a good risk that the money or the cash could run out. And if the economy is not recovering quickly, that could even bring a greater anxieties or even much greater financial burden upon the individuals. So again, the first question is, how do we know that a Chinese consumer are spending more? And number two is, why are we confident that spending more, that's a good sign, lead to something more positive for the economic projection? Your thoughts?
So, okay, to answer your first question, So within the article, I use the disposable income data, right? And this is actually directly from the Chinese government announcement, right? It's not my number, right? So it's something that's officially announced by the Chinese government on the official Chinese government website, right? It comes out to about $5,511 US dollars per year for the average Chinese person, right? In terms of the disposable income. Again, this is the average figure, right? So for some people, it might be higher. For some people, that is lower, right? I don't know if you know this particular news, but back in 2020, right, the Prime Minister of China at the time, Li Keqiang, mentioned that about 600 million people in China is living on less than 1,000 yuan a month, right? 1,000 yuan is about 160 US dollars, right? So that's about half the Chinese population, well, a little bit less than half, that is earning significantly less than this disposable income figure that the government has announced. So, of course, there's not really a balance there. But, of course, we can look at this average figure of about 5,000 US dollars, right? Versus in the US, we're talking about more than 11 times, right? Around $60,000. So there's a significant difference there. Right? So if you look at this figure, right, and you look at the figure that comes from the Chinese government for the total private consumption of the economy, right, which I actually pulled here online, right? So in China, the total private consumption of the entire economy is about $7 trillion, right? And in the US, it comes out to about $18.5 trillion, right? So the US is about 2.6 times that of China, right? So if you take that $7 trillion and divide it by China's entire population, the private consumption comes out to about $5,000 per person, yeah? So again, all of these are official numbers. So if I compare the $5,000 private consumption per person in China versus the $5,500 this per capita disposable income, we can see that, well, Chinese people, they're spending pretty much everything that they earn, right? Whereas in the US, this is significantly less. The private consumption per person in the US comes out to about $55,000, right? Which is significantly less than the 60,000 sort of this per capita disposable income in the US. Yeah.
Well, Xiaochen, again, going back to the point is, at this moment, and also, we had a brief discussion before taping the show, it's the unemployment rate. I mean, we're still, the younger generations in China today, they're still hungry for jobs. I mean, there's no denying that. I'm not saying that 1.4 billion people are all going to get jobs, in this 2025. But the job markets are rather competitive, and this is a fact. And we cannot deny them. And so at this moment, for the youth and who freshly graduate out of colleges or universities, for them, that to spend more money, that is definitely a risk. And also it is rather dangerous for them to continue to invest their money into the job market without anything in return. So again, how do we understand that? Because this is something that you also wrote in the article as well, and you wrote, and I quote, with the youth unemployment rate stubbornly high at more than 17%, and consumer confidence continuing to hover near a record low, there's a plenty of downward pressure on both wage levels and the sales revenue. So what is your explanation, and also what is the insight behind that?
Well, I mean, to be honest, at the end of the day, we don't have an easy way to significantly change the situation without creating better jobs, without creating more jobs, right? I don't really have a solution. That's why I sort of end the articles right there, right? But my point here is that when people talk about China and how China needs to reset its economy, to rebalance its economy, people assume that while Chinese people have more ability to spend, right? They have more savings than the average American, which is something that I mentioned as well. The average American saves about 3% of their income, right? In China, it's much higher, right? So they assume that Chinese people have the money to spend, right? They just don't spend it. They choose to save, right? But what I'm saying that this is not the case, and this is something that you allude to as well, right? there's no guarantee for Chinese people to continue getting the wages, however low it is in the future, right? Because of this risk of economic downturn, because of the stubbornly high unemployment rate, right? It is necessary for Chinese people, of course, to spend in order to support the businesses, to create the jobs, but also to understand sort of the future risks to their own income so that they can continue to save a little bit for those rainy days ahead, right? So I don't know. It's a very difficult question to answer. Right? There's not really much insight, unfortunately, or easy solutions that we have in order to boost the disposable income gap that we see between the U.S. and China, right? And to bring China to a level where a greater share of the country's GDP goes to private consumers. Right? There's no easy way, right? And for now, from an outsider's perspective, whether it's from the American politicians' view or from the European politicians' view, right, they see that China is trying to solve this issue by exporting, right, by having the manufacturers manufacture, right, and to export as much as possible to the global market in order to maintain those manufacturing jobs back home in China. But whether this is true, I don't know, right? That's why we have to explore a little bit more into what other sectors in China, right? Especially the ones that are specifically geared toward domestic consumption, right? I mentioned IT, I mentioned tourism, right? These are potential areas where we can potentially see whether, the Chinese economy can support more jobs, can support more consumption.
Xiaochen, I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about another factor. Again, this is not something that you wrote in the article, but it's still happening around the globe, which is related to the concept of depopulation. And we know that today, for example, China, Japan, South Korea, and also including the West, I guess from this global sense, that we are seeing the population decrease instead of increase at this moment. And the Chinese government, it's very much concerned and also anxious about what's happening. I mean, again, we've seen survey and also seen the articles, and especially throughout the media, one after another, that the younger generations today are not very much interested in building up families and having children, etc., compare with the traditional or even conventional family value. Now, you are not a sociologist, but let's talk about this economic standpoint. How much do you think that this trend has a lot more to do with the current economic uncertainty? I mean, again, it didn't really happen just randomly in 2024. I believe post-COVID, at the end of the 2022, beginning of 2023, we're already seeing that this depopulation around the globe. And China, it's definitely one of the major countries are facing the crisis. So from your perspective, how much do you think there's a correlation between depopulation and also this economic uncertainty or this economic unknownness? Your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you that the sort of the depopulation issue or young people not choosing to have kids in particular is not a pure economic issue, right? Even if you look at outside of China, if you look at countries like the US, for instance, and especially here in Southern Europe, right? Italy, for instance, has one of the lowest population growth around the world, right? Of course, its economy hasn't been doing exceptionally well, but it's not exceptionally bad either, right? But sort of the population growth has been collapsing, even though the economic growth has been staying relatively stable across the past decade or so. So, of course, the economics has a sort of influence on whether people choose to have kids or not. But I believe sort of the social environment is a much bigger factor in terms of what affects whether people have kids or not, right? It's more about their personal values, what they see as their goal in life, and what sort of the social and political environment that they see their kids are potentially going to be facing, right, if they choose to give birth to some, right? So when they feel like they don't see a particularly optimistic environment for their children, and this is not just talking about the economic environment, right? They might choose to just simply not have kids, right? And of course, society no longer has that sort of pressure on young people to have kids, right? For instance, in Chinese culture, right, grandparents and parents will pressure their kids to have kids, right? And this pressure was a lot stronger in the decades past compared to now, right? For instance, I myself, I'm married. I don't have kids either. I don't get much pressure from my parents either. So we'll probably just still not have kids in the future. Right? So I think the social environment has much more to do with economics. But coming back to your point about sort of the economic situation's impact on people choosing to have kids or not, I think in China, this is particularly important to think about as well, right? As our data has shown, people already spend a significant amount of their disposable income already, right? And most of these, and for many people, they're already doing so without having kids, right? So imagine the expense that goes along with having kids, right? Especially when you have this correlation between social expectations and economic spending. Right? For instance, in sort of Chinese culture, right, sort of kids are expected to go to good universities, right, to get a good education, and all of that costs a lot of money. Right? So that sort of expectations on how much money you're supposed to spend on your children, right, to be socially acceptable, also makes it economically difficult for people to contemplate having kids.
Xiaochen, I want to wrap up our conversation by going back to the article. Again, let's briefly talk about the trade war. I mean, again, this is going to happen really fast. And again, we don't know what would happen between China and also Donald Trump. But no one would like to see the repetition of the trade war between Trump and China. Now, at this moment, your final thoughts. How serious are we looking at that Trump continue to put pressure upon China and also put tariffs and also this, what we called this economic rhetoric in order to make the message across the field? Your final thoughts.
I think there's definitely room for Trump to continue putting pressure on China, right? On the campaign trail, he mentioned that we're going to tax 60%, well, 50 to 60% on all Chinese imports, right, to the U.S. So he might fulfill that promise at a later date. We don't know. That's an uncertainty. But for me, there is an even bigger worry, right? And that is when China itself gets tariffed. A lot of Chinese firms move abroad, right? They move to Southeast Asia, they move to Europe, they move to Latin America in order to avoid tariffs and still ultimately export to the U.S. But Trump and some of his officials are now looking at ways to plug these gaps as well. And that's part of that kind of explains. That's part of the reason why he has decided to go after Mexico. Of course, there's a lot of reasons to go after Mexico, right? But one of the reasons is that a lot of Chinese firms are now moving into Mexico and using Mexico as a new manufacturing base in order to export to the U.S., right? So that is very concerning for the American government, right? So because they want to ultimately achieve this goal of a manufacturing renaissance in the U.S. itself, they need to make sure that Chinese manufacturing firms are not simply moving to a new country every time a country gets tariffed. So because of this overall trend, I don't see this trade war as simply between the U.S. and China, but about U.S. versus everybody, right? Because global business has been global for many decades now, and industrial supply chains are very nimble, right? If one country gets tariffed, it can move quickly, right? And for the U.S. to stop this moving, they have to basically tax everyone, to tariff everyone, right? In order to get people to ultimately move back to the U.S. So I see China being a victim, but I see the whole world being a victim as well of this trade war.
Well, Xiaochen, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show for our future episodes when we talk about those global issues. So thank you so much for doing this.